Welcome to Real Deep Stuff. We've saved your seat at the table for this conversation. We're so glad you're here. Did you know April is National Donate Life Month? To bring awareness to this important topic, I've asked a dear friend of mine, Wilkie Pitman, to come share her story of her amazing, incredible, life-changing journey with her double lung transplant. Stay tuned after our conversation to find out how easy it is to become a registered donor. Let's get to part 1 of a part 2 series now. We are so excited to have live and in person one of my dearest friends. I have known you for so long, since our kids were in preschool together.
Yes,
yeah.
Good times, good days.
Yeah, Wilkie Pitman is here in the studio with us to share her journey of her health, predominantly with her lungs and her double lung transplant. So this is a tender topic. We'll go as slow as we need to go. We're going to be so interested to hear all the ways in which God worked in your life to bring apart a second chance for you. So without further ado, Wilkie, would you mind sharing with us a little bit about yourself to kind of let us get to know you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, first of all, for having me. It's truly an honor and a blessing to be able to share this story. I'm a little emotional. I'm going to try to get past that because I know that one of the messages I think of this story is that our God is in every detail of our life. Don't ever doubt that He doesn't know about every single aspect and everything that concerns you, and the way that He attends to every detail and prepares you for what is ahead in your life. I think that's one of the core messages of my story, and also obviously hopefully it's one of great hope and encouragement, and a testimony of the faithfulness and goodness of our Lord. But as far as for me, just to let you get to know me a little bit better, I've lived in Charlotte for about 35 years, I suppose. Met my husband here. Brent I'll just take a moment to say that I really hit the jackpot marrying my husband. God knew that I was going to need a husband that would live up to the vows that He made to me 35 years ago. He's a wonderful caregiver. He's had to learn to be a nurse and a therapist, a psychotherapist, all of it, to support me on this journey. And I literally could not have made it without him. So yes, my husband and I, we've been married for 27 years. We have 2 kids, Grant and Emily.
Which are wonderful.
Absolutely.
They're amazing.
I'll take a minute to brag on them too.
Yes.
They're both college graduates. They've graduated shortly after my transplant. So they both had to go through a lot when they were in college. Not only it was the COVID era and having to navigate all of that with online learning and all the challenges that a lot of college students, even other younger kids, had to face in school through COVID, but they were also dealing with a mother who was critically ill and facing a very difficult surgery and recovery. And not only did they get through that, but they soared and really outperformed anyone's expectation. They both graduated with honors, so I'm going to brag on them a little bit. It just amazes me. It's a testimony to their strength and their determination, and their poise in dealing with something that difficult. So
they are wonderful.
Yeah.
They have just like their mom and dad. They have huge hearts, super smart. They're
great. It's, I love being a mom, and there's different stages of motherhood, but I love having adult children. It's been a lot of fun. It's been great. So a little bit more about me, though, that plays into this whole journey is that I was a physical therapist for 35 years. A lot of that time was spent here in Charlotte working predominantly in the home health market. So I made lots of home health visits and worked primarily with geriatric patients, which I loved. And when you have a job like that, a lot like nursing, it's a calling. It's not really a job. And
Absolutely.
God intended for me to be a physical therapist. That's a whole other story for another day, how that miraculous thing happened. But, I will say one ironic thing was my very first job out of PT school was at Duke Medical Center. And that where I had my transplant 35 years later. And not only was I an employee of Duke, but the physical therapy department was so large and the medical center there is so big that they had teams of therapists. So you would have your orthopedic team and your a med-surg team and rehab. I was on the cardiopulmonary team.
What?
And so they were not doing lung transplants at that time. I don't think they did their first lung transplant until 1995, and this was 1985, so y'all can do the math. I'm old. They had recently actually just started doing heart transplants. In fact, they did their first heart transplant at Duke in April of 1985, and I started to work there in June, just a few months later, and I was on the team that worked with those patients. Whoa. So it was like, I can look back now and say the Lord was dipping my toe into the transplant world and giving me exposure. And fast forward 35 years, it did demystify the whole world of transplant.
You had like a sneak peek.
I did.
Yeah.
So that was, another one detail that the Lord was using to prepare me. So physical therapy has been a big part of my life, a big part of my identity, really. And then just about me for fun, we love to travel. We've enjoyed traveling and taking our kids abroad, doing a lot of traveling here in the States. We've been on mission trips together, so that's a big passion of ours. A lot like Christy and her RV world. We used to have a camper. We did a lot of camping when the kids were younger. It was a big part of their growing up, is taking camping trips with other families and enjoying those times. We love the national parks. I think I was counting the other day because we took a trip a few weeks ago and I checked off 3 more states. So I've been to a total of 33
Nice.
of the 50 states, and I kind of have a little goal for myself to hopefully do as many as possible. I'd love to do all 50. I'm not sure if I'll run out of time for that, but it would be nice. So yeah.
I still think about your trip to Australia.
That was a good one.
That was a bucket list.
That was a great one. Yep. Not going back there again though. That flight's a little long, a little grueling, but yeah, that was a good trip. And as far as just fun things that I like to do, traveling is something I can still do, and I'm grateful for that. There are a few things, like I used to really enjoy gardening and flowers especially, and that's something I can't do anymore. There's fungus and things in dirt that the doctors don't want you to be exposed to, so I'm hoping Brent will catch the bug and enjoy that, but at this point, he's not really there yet, so that's
not everyone's born with a green. I'm not. I don't have a green thumb.
I've had to let that one go, but it's also been a nice time of discovering new things to do. And so one of the new things that I've learned to do recently is I've learned to play Mahjong. And I've joined a Mahjong group in Waxhaw, where we live now, and meeting new people. And that's been a lot of fun.
I hear that Mahjong is quite
it's having a moment. It's
fun.
Definitely having a moment.
Yeah.
So my sister's getting ready to retire in a couple of months. And she said that some neighbors and friends of hers in the Dilworth area, we're going to be starting a Mahjong group, so I'm going to try to go and play with her, and that'll give us something that we can do. So you find things to do. Life changes, but you can still find things to do.
Sure.
Fun things to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for letting us get to know you a little bit better.
Sure.
And so if we turn the page, metaphorically speaking, to your lung journey, could you please share with us the backstory to needing a double lung transplant?
Sure. So I don't want to bore everyone with too many details, but I do feel like some of these details will come up again later in the journey, so I'll try to share them as concisely as I can. But the journey really started for me in early 2019. I had been coughing for a while, and that was really my only pre-diagnosis, I should say, not pre-transplant, but my only symptom before I got my diagnosis was that I was coughing. And truth be told, I had probably been coughing for a couple of years, but it was something that I had always attributed. I had been to the doctor several times with different things, and it was always considered to be allergies, so I really didn't think too much about it. But in early 2019, it was out of control, and it was annoying my family, and they're like, you need to do something about that. So I did go back to the doctor again, and I said, I'm ready to kind of get to the bottom of this. Would you refer me to a pulmonologist? So I did get a referral, and I went to see the pulmonologist. She did a chest x-ray, didn't like some things that she saw, and she ordered a CAT scan. And when the CAT scan came back, it showed a lot of extensive scarring in my lungs. And her words that I can still remember was saying, this didn't happen overnight. Like, what's been going on with you? This looks like years-long issue with your lungs. So I knew that didn't sound good. And with my medical background, I knew
what some of the possibilities were, and they were pretty grim.
Maybe like thinking COPD or emphysema, that type of thing?
The scarring in my lungs was fibrosis in my lungs.
Okay.
And one of the principal causes for that is a disease called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. We call it IPF. Lung fibrosis can be a result of other diseases. A whole host of autoimmune diseases can cause that. For example, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, scleroderma, Sjogren's disease. There's numbers of them.
Okay.
So the good news about that is those are treatable diseases. And if those were the cause of the fibrosis in my lungs, I could be treated for those things. And although the scarring that they saw on the CAT scan could not be reversed, it could be halted possibly and not progress any further.
Sure.
And so they weren't real sure, though, with the look of the CT scan, what it was. And to get the ultimate diagnosis, they needed to do more testing. So she referred me to a rheumatologist who did all these tests and looking for those things, the lupus and all of this. And none of those tests came back conclusive. It was interesting because I was actually mildly positive for a whole host of autoimmune diseases, but not strong enough to be a conclusive diagnosis. So it was determined between the rheumatologist and the pulmonologist that I should have a biopsy of my lung to get to a definitive diagnosis. So medically, in the medical world, things don't happen very quickly. So I mentioned that this started like in January of 2019. So we're already now summertime of 2019. It's June or so when I got referred to a thoracic surgeon to have this biopsy. Wow. They were going to do a thoracotomy where they go between your ribs from the outside of your rib cage and do a wedge resection of lung tissue and biopsy that.
That sounds very painful.
It's considered a major surgery. I was told it would be about a 4-week recovery.
Wow.
And so I had worked.
Biopsy.
Yeah.
Wow.
It wasn't as a simple biopsy like they have for other procedures. So, I worked the day before, and I mean, my life, just to back up for 1 minute, I remember Emily and I went to New York City a month or two prior for her spring break, and I was walking 15,000+ steps a day and up and down the subway and all this.
That's what you do in New York City.
In New York.
Sure.
And so I really wasn't sick. I was coughing, and this was it. So anyway, I had the biopsy. It was the end of July. I went to work the day before, worked a full day, fully intended to be right back there in 4 weeks after my recovery. But that wasn't in the cards for me. So had the biopsy. The surgery was tough, a little harder than I thought, but it was okay. I went home and was working on getting my strength back and everything. 2 weeks after the biopsy surgery, I went to my pulmonologist to get the results, and that's when they did diagnose me with the idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And what that means, idiopathic means they don't have a cause. Mm-hmm. And my medical background knows, I've had patients with that disease. If you were to Google it, it would tell you it's a terminal diagnosis. Oh. There's no treatment. There's no cure. And furthermore, the prognosis is about 3 to 5 years after diagnosis. And the only thing that I could hear in my mind was the doctor saying, "What's been going on with you? This test shows you've had this for a long time." So my first thought was, I don't have a long time here. This is going to probably be pretty short for me. And I do know that, of course, a lung transplant is something that they do often for IPF patients, but it's a end of life diagnosis, this IPF. So of course I was very devastated.
Right.
I left that office that day, and by this time it's middle of August, I suppose, and the doctor did not have a chest x-ray facility in her office, but her office is in a building where there was an urgent care downstairs, and she had asked me to stop there and get a chest x-ray on my way out. So I went in there and did the chest x-ray, and when I walked out, I had this sudden, awful onset of excruciating pain, like I was having a heart attack, to the point I had to go back into the urgent care. And I sat in the lobby of the urgent care, and didn't really know what had happened. I just know I was in a lot of pain, and the pain did ease up, and I was able to collect myself and ultimately go home. But I just didn't feel good the rest of the day. I just thought, well, maybe I've been haven't really been anywhere since my surgery. It's been 2 weeks. I don't know how I'm supposed to feel. And I just got terrible news, and maybe I'm just upset. So I just kind of tried to push it off.
Maybe a chest pain could also maybe thinking it's anxiety or panic or, stress.
Yeah, I didn't, we really had no idea. But it did subside, so I went home. But I was having trouble breathing that night, and I have a pulse oximeter that I would wear, and my oxygen levels were low, and I was trying to do deep breathing and repositioning, and nothing was really helping. So the next day, I told Brian I felt like I needed to go to the emergency room. So we went to the ER. I must have looked pretty bad because they took me pretty quickly and very quickly did a chest x-ray, and they discovered that my lung had collapsed.
Oh, mercy.
So the thought is that when I took the deep breath for the chest x-ray, that I caused a hole in my lung. So something ruptured where they had done that surgery. So I was...
So you went all night with a collapsed lung?
I did.
Wow.
Which is not dumb. I share that to say, if you have something like that, don't blow it off.
Wow.
I should have gone immediately, but because that could have been bad. But so that I had an emergency chest tube placed there in the ER, and they sent me by ambulance downtown to where the main hospital, Novant, where my surgeon was. And so the thought was, this is a side effect sometimes with the wedge resection, that there'll be a lung collapse. It's not unheard of, but that typically within a few days or maybe a week, that area will heal itself and you'll be okay. So I was admitted, and we were waiting to see if that would happen. And I was in the hospital for several weeks, and it never did close. So they were able to take the chest tube that I had, was initially set up with some suction to keep my lung inflated, and it had improved to the point that I didn't need the suction any longer, so I could go home with the home version of a chest tube tank. So I did that.
Still sounds very complicated.
It's a burden to carry that little thing around, but they did let me go home. So they said, just give it a few more weeks. So I went home for several weeks, maybe 3 weeks or so, and I was going to the doctor every week or so to get x-rays and check to see if the chest tube could be removed, and the hole in my lung was not improving. So it became evident I was going to have another surgery. So by this time, I think it's in September now. So we have a second operation. They go into my chest wall again through the ribs, and they took out more lung tissue and cleaned up those borders and sewed it up really tight, hoping it would hold. And were able to remove the chest tube. And that surgery was a little harder on me, particularly because it hadn't been that long since the first one.
Right.
And in that procedure, I will mention because it'll play in later, they broke 2 ribs.
Oh, no.
And they didn't bother to repair them or
not?
replace them. They just threw them away.
What?
Yeah.
Wait,
And so
they threw part of your rib away?
they took my ribs out and just disposed of them. They didn't put them back. I'll put it like that.
Did you know that could be an option if that happened?
I knew that. I did ask the doctor if breaking my ribs was a possibility, and he said yes, it was. So I knew that it was possible, but I didn't imagine that they wouldn't repair them. And I never asked that doctor that, and it's kind of a difficult story, something, I've just had to kind of let go of. But I have only imagined that they didn't do that because I don't think he really expected me to live long and need them.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know that to be true, but that's just something I've thought of. But anyway, so the ribs were not repaired, and that plays into the story later. I'll mention it again. So,
well, I didn't realize we could live with missing ribs without there being a major adverse reaction to that with our daily function of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's more a job to protect the lungs than anything else. So you can certainly go without them. You need to be careful. But for me, it did cause problems when it was almost like a hernia in a way. When I would cough, that part of my chest wall in my back would flare out. And again, as I go through the story, after this second lung surgery and repair, I went home. 2 weeks later, my lung collapsed again. So,
same lung.
Same lung. This is all on the right side. I'd
Wow.
have disease in both lungs, but they only biopsied one lung.
Okay, yeah.
And so that's the same lung that had collapsed twice. So they had to put in another chest tube again. And that weakened area proved to be a real problem because every time I would cough, the chest tube would get caught up in that area and twist and tangle and cut it off. And I'd have to go back into what they call now interventional radiology and have that replaced. And I mean, I did this numbers of times.
Wow.
So anyway, the second...
You must have gotten like afraid to cough, like try not to.
And it's impossible. I was coughing constantly. I would have coughing fits that would last 10 minutes, you know.
We all know that feeling when you need to cough, and then like maybe you're in a public setting where you can't. So I can only imagine if you're trying to hold it in. Trying to hold it in makes it worse.
It's hard.
Yeah.
Hard not to cough.
Yeah.
So so the second time my lung collapsed, the chest tube went back in, but there was still hope that maybe it would heal on its own. They also did this procedure called a pleurodesis, which was where they take talc powder and put it into your chest tube, and it surrounds your lung tissue, and it activates with the lining of the exterior of your lung and causes it to inflame, and then it will stick to the chest wall, and it will close up any holes that are causing that pneumothorax, as they call it, collapsed lung.
Fascinating.
And they offered that as an option to try to help me get through this. And I should interject to say, the whole purpose at this stage was trying to get me well enough to be out of the hospital to get to Duke to be evaluated by their lung clinic, their interstitial lung disease clinic, and start the process towards transplant, because they do that as an outpatient. And I was in the hospital hooked up to a suction machine with a chest tube, and so the whole goal was try to get me well enough to get there.
Right.
So this procedure, they told me they wanted to try. I remember them telling me that it would be very painful. And I remember talking to the PA about it that day, and I looked her in the eye, and I was like, am I going to cry? And she just nodded her head, yeah.
Oh.
And then I said, am I going to scream? And she nodded her head, yeah.
No.
Maybe you will.
Oh, wow.
So I was very worried about
Good
it.
questions to ask, though, for your own, like, mental and emotional
just to get prepared.
preparation.
So I had everyone I knew praying about that, because, I mean, you know, who likes pain? Nobody. I didn't want that.
Right.
They ended up trying it 3 times, and I never had 1 ounce of pain at all.
Oh.
And I don't really know why, but it never hurt. And truthfully, Christy, I believe it didn't hurt because it didn't work. And it's a blessing that it didn't work, because had it worked, it might have prevented me from being able to get a transplant, because I don't want anyone to hear this message to say if you've had a pleurodesis that you can have a lung transplant, but it does make it challenging, because they have to like literally scrape your lung off the chest wall to clean it up and get it ready for the new lung. And it could have been a no-go factor for me.
Oh my goodness.
Interestingly, they tried it 3 times, and I don't think it ever felt bad, because my lung didn't respond and didn't inflame, and it didn't work. So anyway, they did hope that would heal on its own. I did go home. I should go back to say, I just want to kind of paint the picture of how I'm kind of generally declining. It's been months now, and I'm going downhill gradually.
Right.
Between the 2 collapsed lungs, I went home on oxygen, so I'm already starting to be on oxygen now at home. It was low levels of oxygen at that time. But then the second time I went back for the second surgery, I came home from that surgery with oxygen, the lung collapsed, and I went back. So when I went back after that second lung collapse, that was the end. I'm not coming back home after that. So by this time, it's like early November, and that was the last time I had been to my home.
That is a long time to.
And I was gone. I didn't return. I'll go on down the story to let you know. I went from Charlotte to Duke, and I didn't come home until May of the next year, so I was out of home. And I also like to say, we had downsized our home just prior to me getting sick, as God would have had it. You know, it was a part of our retirement plan to downsize so that Brent could retire early. And this was before I knew I was sick.
Right.
I was kind of going to the doctors, but I hadn't gotten as far as the pulmonologist yet. But we had decided we would sell our home and downsize, and I'm just so grateful that we did that when I was well enough to do it.
Yes.
We found a smaller house that was easier for me to manage in our life now. It didn't have stairs. And we were kind of thinking ahead to retirement, but we weren't thinking that I was going to need it so soon.
Yeah.
But it was just a blessing that we had done that before all this started. That God helped, nudge us in that direction to get that taken care of.
Absolutely. But you were in the hospital such an extended time, so not only had you not been home, but you had not been back to like your life.
Yeah.
Like as you knew it.
I know. When I finally got back home, it was almost like we had just moved there because I was only there for 6 weeks before my first biopsy surgery. So we had unpacked a lot of things, but I couldn't remember where I put anything when I got home the next year. So we kind of had to start over and do the whole thing.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, the second time my lung collapsed, I'm back in the hospital. And at this point, you get the dreaded news. There's nothing else we can do, is what they said. So I began to talk.
Yeah, never what anybody wants to hear. I can't imagine how devastating that must have been.
Yeah, it was. I knew that transplant was going to be my only option at that point. And even with the diagnosis of IPF that I had gotten several months prior, I knew that might be down the road. But I was thinking like 5 years down the road, maybe 10.
Right.
Who knew? But not months away.
Right.
So,
like right there on your doorstep.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So they began to talk about referring me to Duke. And so there were a lot of hurdles to overcome with that, because when they first tried to refer me to Duke for the normal path to the transplant team, they would not take me. I was too sick. And that's the thing about a transplant. You have to be sick enough to need one, but you have to be well enough to be able to endure it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's the balance. It's a very fine balance, and it can change quickly for people, at least in the lung transplant world. It can change quickly. So I was really too sick in their eyes. The typical journey for a lung transplant, at Duke anyway, is that you are seen as an outpatient for extensive testing. You have to literally be essentially healthy except for your lungs. They would invite you to come to Duke. You're there for 5 days. They check you every test imaginable. Mm-hmm. It even includes like psychological testing. You meet with a therapist and various things.
That would make a lot of sense, because maybe the body's up to it, but maybe the mental health and state of someone maybe isn't up to all of that. I'm glad to hear that they do that side of it.
I absolutely do. So it's a key part of the process.
For sure.
Since I was in the hospital, I wasn't well enough to do an outpatient evaluation. So one of the doctors that I did see while I was at Presbyterian did say that he knew of a doctor at Duke that was doing an experimental procedure called endobronchial tubes, where they go through your trachea into your lungs and they plug the holes that you have in your lungs from the inside, that to treat a pneumothorax, to get me off this chest tube. And so they presented me to this doctor at Duke, and he accepted me as their patient. So I was allowed to go to Duke now. But Duke didn't have a bed. I waited at Presbyterian for probably close to a month before I could be transferred to Duke. But God had a purpose in that. So the one purpose in that was we had friends, and you'll know who I'm speaking of. I won't mention their names for their privacy, but we had a friend from church whose young daughter was also at Presbyterian up in the ICU having uncontrolled seizures, and they didn't know why. This poor child was having this. And our friend, it still blesses me to this day, she would tear herself away from her daughter's bedside to come down to my bedside and pray for me in the midst of her trial. So,
of course she would. I know who you're talking of, and of course she would.
Yeah.
She's a wonderful, amazing person.
She is. And blessing. So we shared a lot during that month of when I was there, and she was with her daughter upstairs. And the blessing for me was that it gave me somebody else to pray for. I don't know how you feel, or anybody listening today. I find it far easier to pray for other people than to pray for myself. And it was a welcomed, I don't want to call it distraction, because it wasn't a distraction. It was a welcome opportunity to pray for somebody else, knowing that in God's economy, we reap what we sow. And when I'm sowing prayers for someone else, that someone is praying for me. Mm-hmm. So the Lord gave a lot of purpose to that time of waiting. But the day did come, and I was able to go to Duke. So now we're about to the middle of December. I've been walking this medical journey since July, when I had my first surgery. So it's now December. And I got to Duke, and they were very quick to get me
That must take, I'm sorry,
No.
that just must take a real emotional and mental toll on you to just go month after month
Yeah.
and enduring what you, it's one thing to, like physically endure it, and then to also emotionally and mentally endure it, and be like, keep your head in the game and get that fight mentality, and we're going to do this.
Yeah. I think back on it, and as I'm telling this story, when you're in the midst of it, it really didn't feel that long to me. And truthfully, I felt like I was in the right place. I mean, I was sick, and you just don't want to not be home necessarily when you need medical help.
Right.
You're in the right place.
Right.
And I felt very well taken care of. I honestly couldn't go on and on about all the people that I saw on this whole long journey, what wonderful care I received. So it really, and being local in Charlotte before I went to Duke, I had lots of visitors. You were one of them. And so, to be honest with you, it wasn't really that hard as far as the time. It didn't feel that long. And I think back, too, it's kind of funny to even say this out loud, but we hadn't told our children any of this was happening. They were in college. They had tests. I didn't want them to know. We were trying to hide it all from them. And I was really hoping to get to Christmas when I could tell them, and when they were between exams and the pressures of school. It was trying very hard to hold off. And I was in the hospital for months, and they had no idea I was even in the hospital.
I remember when I came to, you told me, you were like, my kids can't know about this.
Yeah.
And I thought, how does that work? It's an incredibly selfless act on your part to spare them while they're trying to go through exams. I kudos to you as a mom, because that takes a strong heart.
That's sweet. And the main motivation for that was I knew if they got online and Googled what I had, they would be terrified. Yeah, so I finally did get the bed at Duke, and I went, and I had this endobronchial tube thing done right away. Within like 24 hours, they had me down there doing that.
Which you said was experimental.
Experimental. That's an interesting thing to sign
You're
all
brave.
the paperwork to do something that's not FDA approved.
Right.
They're like, we don't charge you, but we don't, we're not responsible if it doesn't go well.
Yikes.
But, at that point, it was really the only option that I had. So I did that, and it didn't work, unfortunately. But the good news is that now I'm actually I don't know what the word is. I'm a problem for Duke. I'm their problem now. I'm not Novant Health's problem anymore. I'm Duke's patient, and they have to figure out now what to do. So the only thing that they could do was refer me to the transplant team, and it was not the normal path, and a path that I would not have received any other way had I not been their patient and their quote-unquote problem. They made it really clear that there's a lot of hurdles to overcome. For example, all that testing that has to be done is typically not covered by your insurance unless it's done as an outpatient, because it's far cheaper to be done as an outpatient than as an inpatient. So that was one of the first hurdles we had to overcome, and our insurance company agreed to do it. So that was the first hurdle.
Wow.
The second hurdle is you got to pass all those tests, and I got back a clean bill of health, and they test everything. So fortunately, I was very, very healthy despite just having really, really bad lungs. So that was another testimony. So they're doing all this testing, and I'm still kind of waiting. Time's going by. When I first got to Duke, because I had to take that very first bed they had available, I was over in a certain part of the hospital. I think it was like just a general medical surgical floor, and they have an actual floor for just lung patients, and they tried to get me there. And I'd been there for about a week, and they did transfer me onto that floor. And I had previously this nice room with a beautiful window, and when they moved me to the lung floor, the view out my window was a cement wall. It was no sunlight, and I was like, I don't really care for this room. And furthermore, it was like literally right underneath the helicopter pad. So all day, all hours of the day and night, the helicopter would take off and the helicopter would land, and I would hear it. But back to my friend, whose daughter was a Presbyterian. She had to be airlifted to Duke while I was there. And I laid there, and we were texting back and forth, and I heard the helicopter leave to go and get her. And I heard the helicopter land when she arrived.
Oh my goodness.
And I was able to text my friend and say, she's here, she's safe.
I had chills like all over.
Because they couldn't ride with her. They were having to drive, and it was going to be another couple of hours before they got there. And I was able to share with her, she's fine, she's in good hands, she's safe. So, God just...
the mom to mom, like you were giving
all
her
these
so
little
much
details.
peace.
All these little
Because we
details.
just want to know that our kids
Right.
are okay.
Yeah.
Wow. And you were the conduit for that.
Yeah.
Because they put you under the helicopter pad. That is amazing.
When you take time to, recognize all these little details, you just have such peace that, I'm where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
And God's going to take care of it. He can
Suddenly
take care
the view doesn't feel that bad.
If He can take care of these details,
Yeah,
He
sure.
can take care of it all.
Sure.
So, all right, so I've gone through the tests, and every Tuesday at Duke, they have a clinical meeting with all the team to discuss the patients who've been through the testing, to decide if you are a candidate to be in the program, to be listed. And they do that on Tuesday mornings. They still do that to this day. And I knew that after my tests were done, I was going to be one of their discussions, and they would come and talk to me probably later that day or the next day to let me know. And they never came.
Oh.
And another Tuesday came, and then they never came to my room. And a third Tuesday came, and I was still waiting for them to come and tell me what was going to go on.
Oh.
So, third Tuesday that they discussed my case, 3 weeks in a row, the doctor did finally come in. And this was a very hard day because 2 doctors came in, and Dr. Haney is the primary lung transplant patient at Duke. And he sat down in the chair, and he didn't have a good look on his face. My sister and my husband were in the room with me, and he began to talk about what a high-risk patient I was. And the main reason that they considered me a high risk was because of those 2 ribs that were missing in my back from the biopsy surgery in Charlotte. They said, we're concerned about your chest wall. We need to have a chest wall with integrity to hold these new lungs for you. And we've been discussing how we were going to handle that and if we could handle that. And that's why it's taken us so long to get back to you. And he said, we needed to try to find somebody that was willing to go in to the transplant and repair and reconstruct your chest wall.
Mm-hmm.
And before the lungs went in, and we have found a doctor that we feel like can do that. So we're going to be able to do your transplant. So it was a little, scary the way he presented it. It felt like he was preparing me for a no.
Sure. So in those weeks that you had to wait, you just had to wait with no information?
Yeah, I was trying to, I think there again, God was using that time because I had steadily been going downhill. I'm now to the point where at rest, I'm on 8 to 10 liters of oxygen, high flow oxygen. And when I get out in the hallway, I'm requiring 25 liters of oxygen to walk.
Wow.
And one of the things that, when I mentioned earlier that they have you typically come in as an outpatient, once they decide and accept you as a patient, when you're in your window getting close to being ready for transplant, they ask you to relocate to Duke and go through 1 month, maybe 6 weeks of rehab, or they call it pre-rehab, getting you strong and ready, because this surgery is going to knock you off your feet. And they want you to be as strong as possible. Mm-hmm. And I think that was one of their concerns, too, for me, is I was kind of going downhill.
Right.
Am I going to be able to tolerate this surgery?
Yes.
And they kept coming into every day, the whole team, rounds to your room. They're like, we want to get you stronger. You need to get out there and walk. And walking was very hard for me. Mm-hmm. They would have laps. It was 15 laps around the unit would be a mile. And it was a real goal to me to be able to get to where I could walk a mile in a 24-hour period. And I would do it 1 or 2 laps at a time. With my family helping me, pushing the oxygen with me. I was on a walker at that time. And I would walk maybe a couple hundred feet, and I'd have to stop and catch my breath and go a little bit more. So I was using that time, though, before they gave me the go-ahead, the yes, I will be able to do your transplant, to prove to them that I was going to be able to do it. And I was dragging myself out there and making those laps. And then using, I remember I would just memorize scripture and recite scripture. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, and all these things. And each, the first lap I'd be praying for Patricia, and the second lap I'd pray for Diane. I'd use each lap to pray for a different friend, kind of thing. All kinds of motivations to get this done.
Yes.
And most of the times when I would be out there, the doctors would be out in the hall, and they would see me, and I think it really helped them to know that I was going to do what I could, everything that I could.
You're putting your skin in the game too. You're not just saying doctors fix me and it's all on you. Like, you're showing up to do the work.
I mean, it is a very objective list of requirements, but ultimately it is a subjective decision on their part. Because Duke, they do high risk patients, but they have a reputation, and somebody's giving you their lungs. They don't want to just give it to someone that they know has a good probability of benefiting. Right. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So but yet it does feel like at some point it kind of comes down to a subjective human being's yes or no. It's heavy.
Wow.
But anyway,
and to that point, lungs. Looking into a little research on this, that I guess lungs are supposed to be the hardest organ to get a transplant for. Is that true?
I think when you read that, what that means is the procedure is the hardest.
Okay.
They're not the most in need organ. Kidneys are the highest.
Correct.
And I think that's a supply and demand. There's many more people that need kidneys than need lungs.
Yes.
So they're harder to get. You wait longer. But lungs, the procedure is harder, and there's a higher risk of the lungs being damaged in the harvesting process and in the transplant process.
Gotcha.
Things can go awry more than with other organs. I'll break to mention that they did tell me that day, they came in to tell me they would list me, that they would be looking for a donor because my torso's somewhat short. I would need small lungs, and that's kind of unique for lungs. You can put any size kidney into that area of your body, and a heart kind of sits on top of your other organs, so they don't have to worry about size of those organs as much. I mean, I wouldn't imagine they would put an adult size heart into an infant,
right.
But yet lungs have to in this rib cage, and there's not a lot they can do.
Sure.
A 6 foot tall gentleman's lungs would not fit in me.
Wow, I didn't even think of that.
So they told me they would have to that I might have to wait a little bit longer than the average because they would be looking for a donor that was under 5 feet tall. And my first thought is that's probably a kid.
Yeah.
Which is pretty tough to imagine.
Yeah.
So at any rate, they agreed to list me. There was still a few more things that needed to take place. There's a whole long process about how you get on the list and where you are on the list. They do what's called a lung allocation score, which is a very convoluted rubric of test values and your age and all these things. But they do ultimately give you a score, a number, and that puts you on the list. And the higher your lung allocation score, the more dire you need it. I should remember, but I confess that I don't remember my lung allocation score, but it was in the 60s, and most people are transplanted at far less than that. It was a pretty high score.
Is that like on a scale of 100?
It is on a scale of 100, but I don't think anybody ever gets much higher than like in the maybe 70s or so, or maybe 80s. I'm not 100% sure, but I was told my number was pretty high. So it was really a matter of, you have to find a match. There's match for the size, like I mentioned a minute ago, but there's also the blood type match. They also look at antibodies that have to match in some fashion. That's beyond my ability to understand. Very complicated medicine there, but there's a lot of matching. So it's not like you just wait your turn, obviously, to get to the top.
Sure.
So somebody might have needed it more than me, but didn't match as well as I, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think I did put down the dates. I went on the list.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how long did you have to wait.
I was only on the list for 8 days.
8 days?
8 days. And that sounds fast, and it is fast.
Wow.
Duke, their lung transplant program literature says that their average is 14 days. So I knew when I went on the list it wouldn't take long.
That is impressive.
It is. It's better than the national average, but even then, I think the average is somewhere around 4 months, which is nothing like a kidney, which can be years on average.
Well, how did you and your family feel about a double lung transplant for you? And this is a massively huge, but you were probably at a life or death point with decisions.
Yeah, to me it was the only option. I didn't have any options. It was something that I welcomed. It's hard to think about. You wouldn't want to volunteer for that from the get-go, but I knew that it was the only way I was going to be on this planet longer.
Yeah.
So I was grateful and eager
Mm-hmm.
for it. And it was I don't know that anybody, I'm in several support groups, nobody's trying to decide if they want to have it. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
They're like hoping they'll be accepted to have it is more the mentality.
I'm thinking like from the layman's perspective, someone not in the medical field, like your husband and your kids thinking, we're going to turn her over to these people and like literally put her life in their hands to do this massive surgery.
Yeah.
And were they feeling fear and angst of that? Or at this point, were they just like, do it, just do what you gotta do?
I think that because I had this long journey that I've already gone through, so in so many details that, and I'm declining all the way along, that it was a relief, really.
Yeah.
And I'm sure maybe there's other people that have had transplant journeys. That's the thing about a transplant journey, is different for everyone.
Sure.
And mine is not typical for anyone that's listening to this. I don't want to have you feel like if this is something that you may face, that your journey would be anything like mine, because most people are probably a lot healthier than I was when they have it, and have an easier recovery than I had because of that. But yeah, I think we were all, if you think about the loss that somebody experiences, for you to be able to gain a transplant, it's very sobering and upsetting.
Yes.
But we were truly, rejoicing in this, that the answer was coming.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, God did a great work. I was honestly, the only time that I ever felt fear and anxiety was before I knew my diagnosis, way back in June or July or whenever that was, when I had the first biopsy and they told me what it was. I had a sense of getting that terrible diagnosis, and having to fear that that's what it was the only time I felt fear. And of course I was traumatized and upset and cried and everything when they did say it, but shortly thereafter it's like knowledge is power.
Yes.
And
yes.
Now I can move forward to what I'm going to do to take care of this. So it's the kind of figuring it out and waiting that was more anxiety producing. And I remember getting the call. Even though I was in the hospital, I did get a call on the phone, because it's an outside group that procures and orchestrates the donation process. So a sweet little lady called me I was listed on Saturday in mid-January, and it was the next Sunday, 8 days later, that I got a call. And it was so nice because I was all by myself when I got the call, which was very unusual. Kelly, my sister, and my husband had relocated to Durham, and my brother lives in Durham, so they had a place to stay, which was such a blessing. A lot of patients that get transplanted in various centers, they've got to move their whole families and all of this, so we had a place to stay. Brent had left early for whatever reason. Both my children had been to visit me the day before and spent the whole day Saturday, which was in the middle of school for them, which was nice. We were all together. It was a great weekend. It was kind of like I was at a high point, really, and then I just felt fitting that I would get the call that day. And I didn't ever have a feeling of anxiety or worry or fear. Things start happening very quickly. My job was, after I received the call, was to notify the nurse on the unit, and that one call opened a floodgate of people coming into the room. You have untold numbers of vials of blood drawn, another quick chest x-ray. They're scrubbing your body from head to toe with Hibiclens, getting you ready to go.
Wow. If we could break for just 1 second to mention something that I'm sure came up before this point, but before you head into surgery, it's a personal passion, for lack of a better word, for me to advocate for people to have their affairs in order, to have that living will, to figure out their DNR, to figure out their healthcare power of attorney, and all of that. So I'm sure at this point you've probably already dealt with that, but just to take a second, and what would you say to people to highly encourage them to have all that in place before they need it?
Right. So being in the medical profession my whole career, I too have an understanding of what can happen when those things are not in place. It's upsetting. It's difficult. it takes such a burden off your family to know what your wishes are and have that all handled. And so we had all that done years ago.
Good.
So, and of course now if you go to the hospital nowadays, I don't know if you've been in the hospital recently, but
No.
even the doctor's office, they tend to ask you, do you have all this on? And so there's plenty of opportunities to get that done, and it is important. But
For you as a patient that's already undergone so much and is about to undergo a lot more, would you highly recommend people consider taking care of this?
Absolutely.
When there's not a crisis.
Absolutely, when you can think clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, my living will is such that it states that, and I wasn't in a position to have to be on, well, I was on ECMO, which is a form of life support, but I didn't have like cardiac arrest or anything like that happen. But I did tell my husband, don't you tell them to try everything possible. I'm young. I want to live for my children's sake. And so we were all on the same page in that regard. So
Good.
yeah.
It's just so I just wanted to make sure, because if anyone's been teetering about an uncomfortable topic like this, do it when things are not in crisis.
Absolutely.
Because it's a gift to your family and yourself and the care team, right?
Absolutely. It is.
Yeah.
It is. And not just do it, but you need to talk about it and make sure that everybody understands it.
Yes.
This is similar, like, and we're going to talk again, I'm sure, at the end about becoming a donor. But if you are a donor and it's in writing that you want to donate your organs, they will still ask your family when the time comes, do you still want to do this? And they can stop your wishes from being accomplished.
Wow.
So make sure your family knows what you want.
Yes. I'm so open about all of this with my family. We talk about it, and at first our kids were, probably teenagers when I started talking about it with them, just because my own history of loss with family, and I was just like, no, we're good. Listen, you're born, you're gonna die. Like, I want you to know this,
right?
And so you know how to respond, because it's not that I'm so weird about wanting my way. It's that I am trying to lift a burden off of you.
Alleviate the burden.
I'm doing the work for you now.
Absolutely.
Because I've been in that position of a doctor saying, do you want me to override wishes?
Oh, wow.
And
that's a tough one.
That was a very hard one.
Yeah.
And so, I'm just a real outspoken advocate about getting those conversations going
early,
getting that paperwork done one way or the other, whatever your wishes are. Just do it. It's a gift.
Yeah,
it's a gift. Yeah.
Brent and I did that right after we got married, actually. So we had a change of responsible party, basically, in your life was a good time to do that. Maybe birth of children is another good time to think those things through and get them sorted. But
sure thing. Because we just nobody knows what will happen tomorrow.
No.
And so absolutely. So back to your story of you. They're swabbing you down and getting ready for the big surgery. Mm-hmm.
So Duke, as far as other transplant centers too, there is a window of time where when we get this call, it's basically we have a possible match for you. So, or I think the way she says it, we think we have some lungs for you. So what happens when they're getting me ready, there's a team of doctors that go to wherever these lungs are. And that could include an airplane flight somewhere. They do it somewhat regionally because the viability of the lungs once they're harvested has a certain period of time. I think
makes sense.
Kidneys can actually last a little while, hearts even, but lungs have a little shorter time period before they need to be transplanted. So these teams of doctors go off to the donor site. Meanwhile, back at Duke, they're getting me ready. And so there's some waiting. There's like, hurry up and wait. So they get me all ready. I'm down in the pre-op area, all on the gurney, ready to go, waiting for these doctors to come back. I will mention this for people who are listening who might have the beginnings of a transplant journey or know someone, or hopefully that's not in your future, but there is something that's called, in my world, it's called a dry run. And that is where you get the call saying, we have your organs, you get prepped, you're in the waiting area of the operating room. The doctors go off to look at your organs, and they get there and they decide that those organs don't meet their standard.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And they decline them.
Yeah.
And you're all prepped and ready. you're scrubbed and groomed.
But as much
And-
as that prep work was a lot, it's like if you're going to go all this way,
Yeah.
like you want the best possible match.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You do. You want the best possible match. And there's no guarantees about having a dry run or not having a dry run.
Yeah.
I didn't have any. Mine was a go the first time. And a lot of them are, but there are some that are not. And I know there's one man in my support group, and he has set the record at Duke. I think he had 11 dry runs.
11 dry runs.
Which is very unusual. But one or two even is not really unusual. It's not always, I don't want to upset anyone to say that it's absolutely going to happen, because it absolutely may not. It did not for me. But it's something to be prepared for.
Yeah. When you said 11, my first thought was, kudos for that care team for not giving up on him.
Yeah. Well,
that's amazing.
Yeah. It's, and particularly when you think about, I was at the hospital, which was, not as big of a deal, but this might be somebody who's, they allow you to live, for Duke anyway, 2 hours away. You have to be able to get to the hospital within 2 hours of the call.
Yeah.
So I probably would not have stayed in Charlotte, but I could have been at my brother's house. But there are people in my support group that are traveling from Virginia and various places, and they're allowed to be within 2 hours. So they get a call, they drive all the way in, they go through all that, the emotional preparation and the taxing event that is to not get the transplant and have to go home and to do it again and again. It's
so the
devastating.
only way that I can relate to what you're saying is that when I had our first child, it was contractions were 5 minutes apart, packed the bag, I had the makeup on, looked cute, Bruce is filming, we're going to go to the hospital now, it's time. And we drive our 40 minutes to the hospital and get there, and they're like, you're not ready. And I had to go home. And I'm like, but they're 5 minutes apart, And then the second time we went, they were 2 minutes apart, and they were like, well, we don't have a bed for you, and there's other people more ready than you, and you need to go home. And then we got a flat tire on the way home, and it was this big dramatic thing. And that time I looked a little more tired, and by the third time, no more makeup. Like, I didn't even care if I had a suitcase. And they've got me wheeling in, and when the elevator doors open and I'm in that wheelchair, and it was the same nurse, she looked at me, she goes, now you're ready. Okay. And I was like, I hate you. And I'm going to kill you. And I'm like, if you don't take me. So I can only, on a very different note, relate to like, no, I'm not leaving. This must happen right now. But to have to keep coming back, that takes a lot of emotional, mental stamina for someone with a transplant.
It's something to be aware of and to maybe prepare yourself ahead of time. But like you said a minute ago, and how we encourage each other in our support group is that, I'm sure all centers are this way. It is my understanding that when they come to the site of the donor at that harvesting process, it might not meet Duke's standards, but they might meet another doctor's group standard. And so those ones might still be useful, but Duke, at least I can speak for them in my experiences there, they do well because they want the very best for you, and they're not going to settle on lungs that they don't feel like will be the best for you. So for the people in my support group, we can freely encourage them that that's tough, that's hard. We appreciate that dry run is hard, but when your time is there, it will be because they are the perfect lungs for you. Yes. So leading up to the point where they're about to wheel you in, what was it like for you and your family, emotionally, mentally, to kind of mentally prep for what was about to happen? Well, I called both my children to make sure I got to speak to them before. That was important to me, to be able to hear their voices, because you do realize you're getting ready to go through a major surgery. It might not come out the way you planned, although their success rate at Duke is very high. I did have a lot of confidence too, but I don't know if it's because of the trauma of the surgery and the anesthesia. I really honestly don't remember a lot of that night. I'm sure that I was laying there it was late by this time. It's like 10 or 11 at night. And I think about this sweet doctor that did my transplant. He does most of them. There's more than one that does them. But Dr. Haney is the best one and the main one. He does most of them at Duke. And we hear about them on our transplant support group Facebook page. I don't know how these people know these things, but we all talk, and the families are part of the support group, so they'll post, so-and-so just went in. Honestly, it feels like every single one that he does, he starts at around midnight. The man never sleeps.
So he's a night owl.
And mine was that way. I had my transplant through the night.
Wow.
So I know I went down there around 8. I was told that they started around 11ish at night, and I really don't have a lot of memory of that time. But
Did you have anyone like in the hospital on the care team like helping you with the psychological part of, because just like they want you to walk to get stronger, was there anyone coming alongside you to say how are you doing?
Not in a formal sense, but yes, informally. They're all, when you go to a center as big as Duke and a transplant program as big as theirs is, they have a floor, an entire wing for transplant patients. And some of them are there, not like me, waiting to get a transplant, but they're there because they've had a complication post-transplant. And the women and men, all the nurses and the doctors, even though Duke is a great teaching facility, and they certainly have a lot of new graduates that use that as their first job to get all that experience and springboard from there, they have a lot of people who have worked there for a very long time that are very knowledgeable in this very slim portion of medicine.
Niche,
And so they have a lot of understanding of what you're going through. And I mean, everybody, I didn't have any formal therapy or anything like that, but everyone is just so supportive and so encouraging. And, seeing these other transplant patients, even though they're back in the hospital, they weren't as sick as I was anyway.
Yeah.
They might, I had to go back in once with a rejection episode, and I was, I looked that day like I do now, really. I was walking the halls and doing really well, but they want you in the hospital because of the medicines that they're giving you might have a reaction. That's really the only reason you're there. So I saw a lot of people in the hospital that were doing really well. So it was kind of, gave you a lot of hope in that sense.
Sure.
I did have a lot of anxiety after my transplant, and that's very common, they say. And I actually worked with a therapist in the hospital, and after I left, on just processing everything.
It's
I'm sure
traumatic, even though it's positive and for the good for you and all of that. It's still traumatic.
It is. It was. I feel like I have post-traumatic stress, to be honest.
Absolutely. I don't
to this
see how
day,
you couldn't
I don't have
it.
the tolerance for stress like I used to. I mean, my job before was a lot of pressure and a lot of balls to juggle and everything else in your life. And I just kind of can look back on that season and realize I was, running at a very high level of stress.
Yeah. And
I don't have any tolerance for stress now much at all.
Do you mean more like physical or mental?
Both.
Yeah.
Both. I was with our Bible study group a few weeks ago, and we got on the topic of road rage, and somebody was talking about that, and he said something that made it sound so plain and clear, but he said, if you live your life where you try to keep your stress level around a 2 or a 3, then when you get in traffic, you're going to have things that make you anxious or upset, and you might come up to a 4 or a 5, but when you live at a 9, and then you get cut off in traffic, you're at 12, and you're doing things you have to talk to the Lord about later.
Yes. Not in a good mindset for any of that. Yeah.
So I've had to try to adapt that, really. I've thought a lot about that since you said that, and I feel like I've been subconsciously doing that, trying to keep things on the low end, because
it's healthy to keep that cortisol level and, and the adrenaline down. I mean, it's healthy for your lungs, your heart, your every part of us, all of it, and the mental psyche. It's managing stress is a thing. And I think you're wise to listen to your body and your mind to know I have a new normal.
Right.
That is a good thing.
There you go. I've had to, as far as how my life has changed, I mean, I'll never be the same person. You just get a new perspective after a major health crisis like this, and you just learn to not sweat the small stuff anymore.
I'm sure it puts everything in
a
priority, in perspective,
yeah.
new light, all of that, The information provided in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended to replace medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you have any medical concerns or questions, please consult a qualified healthcare professional. Thank you for listening to Part 1 with Wilkie Pitman. Here's a little more information on becoming an organ donor. To donate organs at death is a simple registration process through the state where you reside. For example, North Carolina residents can register online at donatelifenc.org, or more conveniently, anyone can register at the DMV. For live organ donation, the process is a bit more comprehensive, and you can get more info on that at organdonor.gov. Most importantly, make your wishes known to your family so they can honor your request. Thanks again for listening to Real Deep Stuff. Follow us and subscribe to save your seat at the table for the next conversation. Also, check out our Facebook page to continue the conversation on today's topic. We'll see you there.